Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Snyder. Today we're going to be talking about the South and West transformed, the West, specifically, how did it become developed, and what factors played into that. So, here are your learning targets. Analyze the impact of mining and railroads on the settlement of the West. We're going to talk about how ranching affected Western development, and we'll talk about the ways people lived and their impact on the environment and conflict with one another. So let's get started. First great boom in the West, and at first mining was only done by individuals, but by the 1870s, big companies started to take over, and they made it cheaper. The federal government made it cheaper for these companies by subsidizing them or paying for the cost of the cheap land and providing cheap patents for the equipment they were using. And so they push out the individual from mining very quickly, and this helps fuel the nation's economic development. Around these places, these mines in the West, mining towns would pop up. And some of them were called boom towns. Some of them are still around today, and you're filling those out on your maps, but some of them were only called boom towns because they thrived only as long as the mineral held out. If they mine all of the mineral out of a mountain, then nothing is left there to keep the town there, and it becomes a ghost town like said town is here. And in these areas, they sprouted up so quickly. There's a passage in your book that says a guy rode out of town through a forest, and 3 days later he comes back and there are storefronts and people bustling, and it's like the city was there the entire time. But they didn't have time to make a government or anything, so vigilantes were self-appointed law enforcers in these new areas that were so brand new they didn't have time to elect judges or build a jail even. So these vigilantes, such as Batman, were self-appointed law enforcers. Now, the Transcontinental Railroad. It's been talked about throughout the 19th century, but the U.S. expected these railroads out west to be built by the private sector, but they helped out in two ways. They provide money through low-interest loans, and they make land grants, or giving builders wide stretches of land and alternating on each side of the track. Work begins during the Civil War in 1863 and ends in 1869, and the work is the Irish immigrants building from east to west, and the Asian American or Chinese immigrants building from west to east, and they meet at a place called Promontory Point, Utah. Important to know. The effects of the railroad on the West and on the U.S. in general, it tied the nation together. We were West and East. Now we're starting to become one nation. What used to be a 6-month journey to move products and people across the continent is now a couple of days. And now, even with air travel, it's a couple of hours. It spurs economic and industrial development because of the quickness of moving products. Stimulates the growth in town of cities along the railroad, and even intensifies our demand for Indian land. We want even more of it now. And we talked about that last section, how we are exploiting the Indians and breaking our treaties for their lands. Cattle ranching is also a boom for the West, and it's easier now because we move the cattle north and south to the railroads along the Chisholm and the Goodnight Loving Trail. And at first, the cattle are raised on what is called the open range system. And the open range system is when the property is not fenced in, because building fences that large would cost a lot of money. So the cattle are just allowed to wander around. And in the spring, cowboys were hired to round those cattle up and drive them to the railroad. And then the cowboys drive them north to the railroads, and the railroads transport them to the slaughterhouses in the east. This took weeks or even months to get the cattle to drive that far, lengths of hundreds of miles, but it was worth it because it was good profit at first. But a couple of things bring an end to the open range system. In the 1880s, in the era of the cowboy goes by the wayside, factors were the invention of barbed wire, just a really cheap and simple way to fence in a large amount of land, led to the demise of the open range system. They didn't have to worry about their cows wandering off anymore. The supply of beef exceeded the demand, and so that caused the price to drop. And there were freezing winters and summer droughts that hurt the cattle herds. Here are some pictures of the romanticizations of the cowboy made by Western films and artists, and it really is one of the greatest periods in American history. And when people abroad think of Americans, a lot of them think of the American cowboy because it's really not done anywhere else. Farmers decide to move to the plains, and remember, we start in the east and we move west all the way, and we skip all this stuff in the middle, and then we both come to this part in the middle, in the Great Plains. They're the last part of the country to be settled by whites. And the government helps to settle it with the Homestead Act, passed in 1862, and that we offer land to anyone who's willing to basically go out into the plains and live there for 5 years and develop it. They had to dig a well and build a road, and that allowed people to develop the land. Even still today, out in Harlan area, northeast of Fort Wayne, they have rural development programs. You can get cheap land if you promise to live there for a certain amount of time and develop the land.
All right.
The Exodusters are a special group of homesteaders who move out to the Kansas and Oklahoma area. They're former slaves who move out of the South. They take their name from Moses, who led the Jews out of Exodus and into the Promised Land. And what they do there is they plant crops and find several all-black towns there, so they can all be together and work and have a civilization of their own. Women had a job on the plains. They did laundry and tended to the family or the homestead or the house. And if they needed some money, they opened a boarding house, a laundry, or a bakery. And so that is how women contributed to life on the plains. How did these different conflicts in the West take place? Well, there's basically 3 areas. The use of land led to conflicts. Miners want a mine, ranchers want a ranch, farmers want a farm, sheep herders want a sheep. They all clash together. There's also a lot of races and ethnicities. I already mentioned the Chinese, the Irish, we have Mexicans, Mexican Americans, Americans, all clashing out in the West. As far as food, religion, language, and general culture, having that many races next to one another can cause some conflict. And also, who owned these natural resources led to conflict. So let's review. That's the end of the lesson today, so let's go ahead and review. Name one way the Transcontinental Railroad affected Western development. Go ahead and pause it and see if you can do that. Well, tied the nation together. What took a couple of months now takes a couple of days, moves products and people across the continent, spurs the economic and industrial development, stimulates the growth of towns and cities, and intensifies the demand for Indian land. Next, what were 3 ways that people conflicted in the West? Go ahead and pause. The use of land caused tension. Racial tensions obviously caused tension. And ownership of natural resources caused tension. So that is our lesson for the day. That's the end of Chapter 6. Get ready for an assessment of some sort, and I'll see you in class. Have a nice night.